At the end of November 2020, the Ethiopian government announced that its forces had recaptured the capital of Tigray, thereby ending a 4-week conflict. But is the fighting really over? And even if it is, as I'll show, there are still serious questions about the country's longer-term stability. Hello and welcome. If you're new to the channel, my name is James Kerr-Lindsay, and here I talk about international relations, conflicts, and the origins of countries. There's a tendency to think of the end of conflicts in fairly straightforward terms. In one scenario, one side wins a military victory and imposes its will on the other. Alternatively, a peace agreement may be reached. In truth, though, neither outcome is ever as straightforward as it may seem. Invariably, the end of armed conflict merely marks the end of one phase of a dispute and the start of another. The recent conflict in Ethiopia could well be a case in point. While the government went to great lengths to insist that it should be seen as a law enforcement operation, a campaign against an errant local government that was undermining the political stability in the country as a whole, in many ways it had all the hallmarks of something far more serious, with some even defining it as a civil war. Regardless of what one calls it, the reality is that while the central government may now argue that the fighting is over, there are very real questions about whether the conflict is really at an end. More to the point, the effects of the conflict may well be felt for a long time to come. Regular viewers will remember that I covered the background to the Tigray conflict in a recent video. I've put a link to that earlier video above and in the description below. But by way of a brief summary, the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia is a landlocked state located in East Africa. With a population of around 115 million people, it's the continent's second most populous country. The Tigray region lies in the north of Ethiopia and shares a border with Eritrea to its north and Sudan to its west. With a population of around 6 million people, it's the fifth largest of Ethiopia's 10 federal regions in terms of inhabitants and seventh in terms of geographical area. The origins of the conflict lie in the overthrow of Ethiopia's government in May 1991 by a number of rebel groups. The most significant of these was the Tigray People's Liberation Front, the TPLF. As a result, and despite the region's relatively modest size, ethnic Tigrayans exerted huge influence in the Ethiopian government over the following decades. But this all changed in 2018 when a new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed Ali, who came from another of the country's ethnic groups, took power. Seen as a reformer, he challenged the power of the TPLF, reducing their influence over the state. This prompted a backlash from the TPLF, which now accused the Prime Minister of overreaching his powers and of trying to abandon the country's federal structure in an effort to centralise power. In the period that followed, tensions grew between the TPLF, which still controlled the administration in Tigray, and the central government. Matters came to a head in the first half of 2020 when the Ethiopian government announced that elections would be postponed due to the coronavirus pandemic. In Tigray, the regional government decided to go ahead with the vote. Once again, the TPLF won another overwhelming victory. But this was rejected by the central government. Following a series of incidents, including a raid on a military base on the 4th of November 2020, the central government announced that it had launched a military operation against the TPLF to restore law and order in Tigray. At the start of the conflict, there were very real fears that the government's operation could mark the start of a long and bloody conflict. The TPLF was not only well organised and well armed, it was also understood that it had as many as 250,000 personnel potentially under its control. In addition, many senior TPLF leaders had direct military experience within the Ethiopian National Defence Force, the Federal Army. In the weeks that followed, very little news emerged about what was happening in Tigray, as all communication with the region was cut. That said, reports appeared alleging serious attacks on minorities and civilians by the two sides. At the same time, international aid agencies noted that tens of thousands of people had fled the region into refugee camps in Sudan. This led to widespread calls for the Ethiopian government to hold peace talks with the TPLF. Despite receiving a delegation of respected former leaders from across Africa, the Prime Minister made it clear that he would not negotiate with the TPLF, which he characterised as a criminal clique. The government also issued a reminder to the international community that non-intervention in the internal affairs of other countries was a fundamental principle of the international legal order. This in turn drew strong criticism given that the Ethiopian Prime Minister had in fact been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize just 1 year earlier. Despite the lack of verifiable information about the conflict, within a few weeks the government reported that it had taken control of most of the main towns in the region and was closing in on Mekele, the Tigrayan capital. Then, on the 28th of November, a little over 3 weeks after the conflict started, it announced that Ethiopian forces had entered Mekele, thus marking the end of the last phase of the operation against the TPLF. As far as the government was concerned, the fighting was now at an end. But is this really the case? While the government will no doubt wish to draw a line under the issue, there are good reasons to suggest that this may not in fact be the end of the story. For a start, it's unclear whether the fighting is really over. While the government insists that it now controls Tigray, the TPLF insists that it's certainly not beaten. In comments sent to various news agencies, the front's leader, Debretsion Gebremichael, insisted that it remains actively engaged in fighting Ethiopian forces. This has prompted fears that Tigray may now be entering a phase of guerrilla warfare. If this is the case, while the government may have been able to assert its control over the region using overwhelming conventional forces, how well placed is it to handle a longer-term insurgency, not only in rural and mountainous areas, but potentially also in towns and cities? Rather than a swift and convincing victory, was this merely round one of what could end up being a far more protracted conflict? Then there are significant political questions. As well as imposing a 6-month state of emergency at the start of the conflict, soon after fighting began, the central government, following a decision taken in the federal parliament and under the terms of the constitution, imposed a provisional administration in Tigray under a local chief executive and including officials from parties legally operating in the region, as the government put it. Quite apart from whether this enjoys any sort of local legitimacy, there will be questions about when a vote will be held for a new democratically elected administration in Tigray. This will almost certainly put the federal government in a difficult position. If it holds off allowing a vote, it will be accused of a power grab. This will lend credibility to TPLF claims that the central government was always looking to water down, if not abolish, the country's federal system. However, Addis Ababa will equally be aware that a return to local rule also poses significant risks. While it might be tempting to formally keep TPLF members out of the government and ban them from standing in any future elections, this may give them even more of an incentive to take up arms. It could also feed local resentment against the federal government. However, letting them back in could also perpetuate the tensions between the central government and Tigray that we've seen in recent years. But all this points to what could be an even greater problem on the horizon. Ethiopia is one of the few countries in the world that explicitly permits secession. Under Article 39 of the country's constitution, every nation, nationality or people has the right to break away. Moreover, the constitution lays down a very precise, though potentially lengthy, mechanism for this. How will the government react if a future Tigray regional administration, whether underpinned by TPLF members or responding to popular resentment against the federal government, initiates such a process? Here again, the dangers of going either way are obvious. Blocking a request for a referendum would further feed resentment, but allowing it opens the way for the start of a potential dissolution of the country. This all brings us to the third major aspect of the situation. What are the wider consequences of the conflict for the country as a whole? The developments will no doubt be watched closely by other regions. How will they regard the imposition and perpetuation of direct rule? While many will no doubt see it as a necessary and legitimate step against the TPLF, will others see it as the start of efforts by the federal government to abolish the federal structure as the TPLF suggested? On top of this, if the government then bans any attempt at secession or even moves to amend or remove the secession clause from the federal constitution, what wider effects will this have on the country? Will the region start to become more unstable and restive amidst fears that they too are on the brink of losing their autonomy and right to break away? At the moment, these are all just questions, but they're questions with extremely serious implications for the country's longer-term stability. When fighting broke out in Tigray at the start of November, there were fears that it could herald the start of a prolonged war between the Ethiopian National Defence Force and the Tigray People's Liberation Front. And yet, although we currently know very little about how the conflict unfolded, within a month the federal troops had retaken the major towns of the region and set up a provisional administration in Tigray. But although it's clear that the government has essentially managed to gain effective control over Tigray, it's unclear whether the conflict has truly ended. Already observers are pointing to the possibility of guerrilla conflict. But even if this doesn't happen, there are still serious questions about what will happen next. The federal government will face a series of serious choices over the return to democratic rule in Tigray and the consequences that this could have for the unity and stability of the country as a whole. While the war may appear to be over, is Tigray and Ethiopia as a whole now facing a period of prolonged instability? I hope you found that interesting. If so, here are some more videos that you might find useful. And don't forget to like, subscribe and turn on the notifications bell to be alerted when I upload new videos. I post new ones every Friday. Thanks so much for watching and see you in the next video.